The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 10, Segment 2, Flight Delays.
After needlessly wasting more than an hour at Parkland Memorial Hospital, Lyndon Johnson gets back to Love Field with his entourage. He gets back to two planes that exist on the field. One carried the vice president originally, and one carried the president. Now, with Johnson at Love Field, and everyone telling him to get airborne and to get out of the city, he did. He wasted another 65 minutes on the ground at Love Field, and he did that for two reasons. One, he still had to tie up loose ends, and there was one major loose end still running around Dallas. And he wasn't going to leave until he got word that that loose end had been tied up. The other reason Johnson stayed at Love Field was retribution. He began his campaign of retribution against the Kennedy family within minutes of becoming President of the United States. At 1:40 p.m., Lyndon Johnson arrived at Love Field with Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry driving him. Also in the car is a Secret Service agent and another congressman, together with the hitchhiker, Congressman Elbert Thomas. While Johnson was going up the ramp to Kennedy's plane, along with his wife, the Lincoln Continental that Kennedy sat in the motorcade had already arrived at Love Field and was being shepherded onto a C-130 cargo plane for return back to Washington, D.C. Johnson got on the plane, and its engines were already running, ready to take off. But the plane didn't go anywhere, and the captain was actually told to shut the engines down because Johnson was going to be there a while. Within minutes of being on the plane, Lyndon Johnson received two calls. First, from McGeorge Bundy, JFK's national security advisor, who told Johnson that he should leave Dallas immediately, stay on the plane, keep radio contact with the White House as he returns to Washington, D.C. Johnson declined. Right after that, Johnson's aide, Walter Jenkins, calling from Washington, also advised Johnson to get in the air and to return to D.C. immediately. Johnson ignored the request. The next thing Lyndon Johnson did was the start of his retribution campaign against the Kennedys. He called Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, and he said, "Your brother's dead. I want to take the oath of office. Tell me what I should say." But actually, there was no reason for the request at all, because the vice president immediately succeeds to the presidency upon the death or incapacity of a U.S. president. After that, Johnson then said, "I want to transfer my luggage from the plane I came in on to Kennedy's plane." A 2-hour and 13-minute flight from Dallas to Washington, D.C., necessitated in the midst of a supposed world crisis, the new president transferring his luggage? Clearly, that was an excuse to buy time. In addition, Johnson, sitting on the plane, says, "Hey, you know something? Things are going pretty good, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find out where Judge Sarah Hughes is, and I'm going to have her swear me in as the new president." A search for Judge Sarah Hughes to come to the plane to swear Lyndon Johnson in. Another check of retribution against the Kennedy family. And the reason I say that is because there was no need for Johnson to take an oath. That's number one. And number two is Judge Sarah Hughes was a federal judge that received her federal appointment, although both John Kennedy, and more particularly his brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, did not want her appointed to a federal judgeship because she was too old. She was 65 at the time. But another Texas politician, Sam Rayburn, managed to get her the appointment, which embarrassed Lyndon Johnson as Kennedy's vice president. So by Johnson requesting that Sarah Hughes swear him in, was sticking it to Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy family even more. Nothing could have been worse except for Johnson returning with Kennedy's body. And as the plane sat on the tarmac at Love Field at about 1:56 that same afternoon, the same time that Lyndon Johnson is delaying for luggage, for delaying for taking an oath, for delay for getting a federal judge, for delay for getting Kennedy's body back to the plane, Lee Harvey Oswald is arrested in a Texas theater and is being brought back to the Dallas police station. And of course, who's there to advise Lyndon Johnson about this catch of a suspect? None other than Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry just happened to be on the plane for the next hour waiting for Lyndon Johnson to be sworn in. Jesse Curry relayed that information of Lee Harvey Oswald's arrest to Lyndon Johnson while he was sitting on the plane. At 2:14, Kennedy's coffin is being brought to Love Field and taken up a stairway into the back of the plane after seats had been removed. Once the coffin containing his body had been placed on the plane, a man by the name of Godfrey McHugh ran to the cockpit and told the pilot, "Take off. Kennedy's body's on the plane now." The captain turned to McHugh and said, "No, we're not going anywhere under order of the new president." At this time, Jackie Kennedy boarded the plane and under this stressful and disastrous day goes to the plane's bedroom to try and compose herself. None other than Lyndon Baines Johnson, lying on the bed, relaxing. Jackie was absolutely shocked. And at 2:28, Sarah Hughes arrives and gets ready to administer the oath. Unfortunately, the unnecessary oath that would be delivered by an unnecessary judge needed an unnecessary Bible to have the oath administered. And since there wasn't one on the plane, they went to the Kennedy bedroom, took a Sunday missal or prayer book from a drawer, brought it out, used it for the swearing in, and of course, Lyndon Johnson, like the unusual politician he was, he kept the missal and actually has it displayed in the Lyndon Baines Johnson Museum in Austin, Texas. After Johnson was sworn in, he immediately said, "Let's get airborne," and Air Force One was ready to take off. I mentioned earlier about Congressman Elbert Thomas, the hitchhiker, jumping into Lyndon's car. Elbert Thomas happened to have been caught by a photographer right after Johnson was sworn in. Right after Johnson turned and smiled at Elbert Thomas, Thomas winked at him. Elbert Thomas, the prodigy of Lyndon Johnson, the college roommate of George Brown, of Brown and Root, the company who Johnson pushed as a government contractor for decades, the company who was accused of giving Johnson bribes, and the company who took all of their bribe records out of their offices, putting it in a shed that mysteriously burned down. That man was the person who winked at Johnson right after he was sworn in. There was absolutely no reason for Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry to take his time and to drive Lyndon Johnson to the airport and then to sit with Johnson at the airport when an assassin or assassins were still not caught and running around Dallas. He should have been the busiest man in Texas, perhaps in the country, at that period of time. Clearly, aside from the jabs at the Kennedy family starting on the plane, what Lyndon Johnson was really doing was waiting for information that Lee Harvey Oswald had either been killed or captured by the Dallas Police Department, and he was safely and securely in their hands. And this information, of course, was relayed directly to Chief Curry, who was on the plane with his buddy Lyndon. At that point, Johnson could depart and head back to Washington, which is what he did. And we'll learn what happened on the plane in the next segment called Turbulence. See you then.